I'm neurodivergent zebra, and my brain is sparkly. I ordained as a priest in training in a Soto Zen Buddhist tradition, and I was profoundly harmed by that priest training process. In a nutshell, there's a lot of things about me that are unique. So I'm neurodivergent. I'm both autistic and ADHDer. And those things mean I need to stim, I need sensory input, and I need to be able to move. And I have a condition called hEDS, which causes a lot of injury and fatigue, which really interacted with my priest training process. And I have a trauma history around both of those. And that leads to what I call an endurance mode, where I just have to get through what's going on. I mask very heavily. Nobody knows that I'm in pain all the time, all this kind of stuff. And that whenever something comes up and things aren't working right, I just assume I'm the problem because there's something wrong with me. The way that this interacted with priest training promoted a very adversarial relationship with my body and mind, which was very damaging. And the way I've come to understand it over the last few years of being on a sabbatical is that the primary issue is one of consent. I didn't just lack consent. I lacked the awareness that I could consent. The idea that I could say no was not even on the table for me. And so that's sort of the thread that runs through all of this for me. So I'm going to go through each of these in some more detail. This is probably going to be kind of long. I do have a 25-page essay if you prefer reading over listening. So I have a condition called hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So this is a genetic condition, and it's a connective tissue disorder. So genetic means it's in my DNA, and DNA code for proteins. And so my DNA code to make an inappropriate kind of protein. There's a defective structure to some of the proteins that my body makes. And it affects the proteins specifically that are in connective tissue. So it's genetic. It means I've had it my whole life. So I've never known any other body. This is all I've ever had. And there's nothing to be done about it. It can't be fixed. There's no editing the genes to make my body suddenly create the correct protein structure. So connective tissue is everywhere in our body. And so this means that this condition is a systemic condition. So all connective tissue is affected. That means skin, organs, the blood vessels, so the veins and the arteries, ligaments in the joints, all the GI tract is almost all connective tissue. The things that support your organs and hold them up is connective tissue. Cartilage is connective tissue. So it's everywhere in the body. The most obvious outward manifestation of this is ligamentous laxity. So that's also joint hypermobility. So all my joints are super flexible. I have experienced a lot of dislocations, which is a joint completely moving out of its location. And subluxations, which are partial dislocations. So the joint moves somehow out of its normal position, but doesn't completely pop out of joint. So this is an almost daily occurrence for me, is these joint misalignment problems. I also have a lot of autonomic issues. So autonomic, when you hear autonomic, think automatic. So autonomic is the stuff that keeps our body functioning without us having to think about it. So our heart rate, our breathing rate, our blood pressure, our temperature regulation. So those are all autonomic issues. And these can all be impacted in hEDS. So I have something called POTS, which is postural tachycardia syndrome. So when I stand up, all the blood pools in my legs because the stretchy vessels down there expand out. So all the blood pools down there. And then my body's like, oh my God, there's no blood in your brain, and freaks out. And heart rate spikes to try to get a little bit more blood up to the brain. I don't regulate my temperature well, so I go from hot to cold all the time. I overreact to small changes in temperature, or even no changes in temperature. My body just swings wildly from hot to cold. It can't seem to control itself. I have some small fiber neuropathy, so I have a lot of nerve pain, and I have a lot of itching and a lot of other weird symptoms with that. And the small fiber neuropathy actually is part of the autonomic thing. So part of how your body regulates itself is through these nerves. And so if there's a problem with them, then it just escalates itself. I also have a lot of issues with electrolyte balance. So my kidneys are like, dump it all. We don't need any of that water. So the more water I drink, the more dehydrated I get because I just pee it all out and all the salts go with it. So I have to take a lot of salts to keep my electrolyte balance. So it's a little bit crazy. I have a lot of GI issues. So gastrointestinal tissue has a ton of connective tissue in it. So there's just all kinds of manifestations from digestive problems, gastroparesis. My stomach will just shut down, and 8 hours later, I will not have digested any food. a lot of nausea, a lot of heartburn, and then just a lot of digestion as well, and problems with pooping and all that kind of stuff. I have a lot of insomnia. That's very common in this condition. And sometimes it's just legitimate insomnia, which can come from an overabundance of adrenaline, actually, that we have. But it can also be painsomnia, wherein you're in too much pain to sleep. So that's always fun. I have a lot of fatigue, and fatigue is not sleepiness. Sleepiness is like the desire to fall asleep, and boom, down you go. Fatigue is just a like profound lack of energy that is difficult to think through. It's difficult to do anything. It's just very, very heavy is how I experience it. And the kind of fatigue that people with hEDS experience is basically the same kind of fatigue that people with chronic fatigue syndrome experience. And in fact, a lot of people who have chronic fatigue syndrome might actually have hEDS, but they just haven't been diagnosed because it's not well known in the medical community. I suffer with chronic pain. So mostly for me, it's in my joints and my muscles. But I have joint pain all the time, and I have muscle spasms all the time. This is a daily basis kind of thing for me. So I'm almost always in pain, almost any minute of the day. If you said, where does it hurt? I would be able to give you a list of things that hurt. And I just thought everyone had that experience. Like, I've known nothing else since my teenage years. I get injured by activities of daily living. So I have subluxations, I have dislocations, or I can injure my tendons and ligaments, cutting vegetables with a knife. I will injure myself. Not through the slicing, but through the like holding the knife, gripping the knife, pressing on the knife, and like all that kind of stuff. I have what I call the grip of death in the cat litter box. Where I'm trying to scoop it, but the problem is I don't know how hard I'm scooping because that's part of proprioception, and proprioception is modulated by our ligaments. So I don't know how hard I'm grasping. So I'm either got the grip of death on something, or it drops out of my hand because I don't have a good enough grasp on it. And then I get a repetitive stress injury in my wrist. So from like 2 minutes of scooping the cat box. As you can imagine, I have a lot of trauma around these injuries. So there are certain physical postures that like spike my fear because I know that literally through thousands of examples, I know this posture is likely to injure me if I don't bite right back out of it. Kinhin is one of my nightmares because it's a lot of time spent on one leg and my knee is not stable. So my physical therapist is like normal people, their legs like this, the calf and the thigh, and the knee is nice and stable. Mine is doing this, and I can feel it. So when I'm doing Kinhin, I'm like, I'm about to sublux, and I'm going to go over, and it is terrifying. So there's a lot of nervous system activation for me around my body, and moment to moment, I don't know if I'm going to hurt myself. I can make a gesture like this, and luckily I didn't hear, but I can injure myself just from making a wild gesture while I'm talking. Every single time I move I go to get up out of a chair, I don't know if my hip's going to be misaligned and I'm going to hurt myself. So living with that kind of uncertainty, it's how can you not have trauma? So that is part of my existence, and that gets activated in the way I experience priest training. So we're going to get to that. I have excess adrenaline, so this is common in people with hEDS. It's often mistaken for anxiety, and I'm sure I do have some anxiety, like I'm not denying that, but how can you separate out if the body is producing excess adrenaline, which they think is related to some of the autonomic issues? That is going to make me anxious. That's what adrenaline does. It's very, very helpful to focus you on threats and alerts and activate you to deal with them. So how can you disentangle that from a mental health issue, which is anxiety, driven by a habit of worrying and a habit of concern, right? Like, how do you disentangle that? I also have a lot of migraines. So especially the neck tension, the muscle tension in my neck goes up and I just get these incredible multi-day migraines. So that's kind of a very quick overview of my hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, or EDS is how I typically call it, or hEDS. And how that interacted with my Zen practice is interesting. So the first thing is this idea of a neutral, upright posture does not exist in my body. I thought everyone was like speaking about it metaphorically. Like I didn't understand that for other people, they literally can find the right the right pelvic tilt, that they have this upright, relaxed posture, and that they're basically exerting very little effort to stay in it. And so it's a way to position the body alertly and relaxedly. I literally have no idea what that even means. If I'm not laying on furniture, I am using muscles to hold myself up. My ligaments do not provide enough up to keep my spine erect. So if I'm sitting upright, I'm doing it through work, and that's going to lead to muscle spasms, and that leads to injuries and migraines. So there's no other direction that's going to go for me. And as you can imagine, this is the only body I've ever known. So, and I wanted to be a functional human being. I mean, I was raised in a capitalist world where you have to support yourself by having paid employment. And so I just learn to push through. Like, it doesn't matter how much something hurts. You just have to push through it. You have to get up and you have to go to work and you have to do the thing you don't want to do, and you got to buy the fucking groceries and you got to cook dinner. Like, there's no other solution in the world that I lived in. Well, I still live in it, in this capitalist world. And so I have this incredibly strong habit of just pushing through. If there's pain, I don't like it, you just push through it. You just do it. Just go. If you can, you dissociate a little bit, like just tune it out. Volume of the body, if you can, just turn it down, put your mind somewhere else. And I call it my endurance mode. Like when it really gets bad and I can't stop the thing, I'm trapped on an airplane and there's nowhere to go. You just have to get through it. Just get through it. Just get through it. So that's what goes through my mind all the time. I call this endurance mode. So you can imagine how this might have showed up for me in retreats. Sitting on the chair, I'm in excruciating pain. And I don't think I can get up because I'm supposed to sit through these sessions. Everyone else seems to be sitting through them, so I just go, just sit through it, just sit through it, just sit through it, just wait for the bell. And so retreats were wildly injuring to me. A huge number of joint injuries, a lot of really deep muscle pain, muscle spasms, and incredibly fatiguing. I used to think that there was like a 1-to-1 ratio. If I did one retreat day, I needed 1 day off to recover. When I actually really stepped back from it, I realized it was more like 10-to-1. And even now, I've been on sabbatical for 2 years. I don't think even now I've fully recovered from the physical exhaustion of trying to attend 18 retreat days per year, pushing my body in ways that it could not function. And even sitting for an hour at my Zen center injures me. So I would go on a Sunday morning, we'd have a half hour of sitting, and when there would be an hour Dharmataka, by the end of it, my whole neck would be seized up, and I would be like, if I'm not careful, I'm going to go home and get a migraine. And so it's like pervasive to every single activity. And there's no seating at any Zen center ever that I have ever seen that is comfortable for me, that supports my body in the way that it needs to be supported, that allows me to be relaxed and alert. So that's hEDS, so that's the genetic condition that I have. The next big piece of me is I'm autistic. And a big way that this is a part of Zen practice is that there's, I have differences in sensory input. So they call it sensory processing disorder. That's fine. I would call it a difference maybe instead of a disorder. And this means that I process sensory input differently than autistic or non-autistic people. You can say neurotypical is the other way to say that. So normal folks. So I process the sense information differently than you. I have a whole separate video actually about sensory trauma, but I'm not going to get into that. So the senses are, right, sight, the 5 that we know of: sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell are the 5 that we're all raised with. And then there's a few more that are actually really important. So there's proprioception, that's where our body is in space. How do I know if my arm is out or in, right? With that sense of where our limbs are in space, or our body position. There's vestibular, which is our balance system. And there's interoception, which is the senses of inside of our body. Am I hungry? Am I thirsty? Do I need to pee? Right? Like all of that process that's happening inside of our body, we can have some awareness of. Some people have more, some people have less. So with the sensory input differences, some people can be hypersensitive, so they're having way more information coming in. And some people can be hyposensitive. There's not enough information coming in. So a common thing is that people can be hyposensitive to interoception. So they have no idea that they're hungry. They literally are not getting that information from their body. And then all of a sudden they're like having a meltdown because they're starving. So that's a really common example that can come up. For me, I tend to be hyper aware. So I am never not noticing things. I never, ever stop feeling my socks touching me, my underwear is touching me, my shirt is touching me. I never stop feeling this. And other people, like, they put on their glasses and then they just stop feeling them. I don't know what that is like. So when people lead guided meditations, they're like, oh, feel your socks on your toes. I'm like, did you stop feeling them? Like, why would you need to remind me to feel those? in this context, food can be beyond repulsive. I mean, my body is like, this is poison. It is completely disgusting to me. I have thrown up into my mouth during oryoki because the food was so sensorily disgusting to me, and I was trying to gag it down, and my body was like, this is not food. This is a life-threatening danger, and we are going to get rid of it. So it's very difficult to live with this kind of stuff. As I'm sure you can imagine, I have a lot of trauma around this. I dissociate. I try to tune my body out as much as I can. I live a life of the mind so that I can just go somewhere else and just like pretend the body doesn't exist if I can. I mask. I'm constantly having something going on. And no, most people don't know about it. I'm just pretending it isn't happening. And I have this endurance mode of like, doesn't matter if that hair is touching you, you got to just do what you're doing. You just got to get through it. And it sounds so stupid, but it's unending sensory information that I just cannot tune it out unless I go completely into a dissociation type of mode. So imagine this is like a newborn infant, right? All the sense information coming in, I have no way to deal with it. I don't have any way to filter it. And it's completely overwhelming. And it's often registering as pain rather than just sensation. How would my brain develop in that context? Like, think about the implications of that from birth, that I'm having this kind of sensory experience. So how would I not have trauma around this kind of thing? So when people are talking about this in retreats, like, oh, just if you feel a tickle, just sit through it. I'm like, oh, believe me, I've sat through 8-hour tickles. Like, I can sit through it. I don't need to prove that to you anymore. But what I'm experiencing is not what you're experiencing, because most people, when they report to me, their tickle goes away after a few minutes, and mine don't. It's because it's usually a physical object touching me. And I'm like, until I move the hair out of the way, it continues to bother me. So the other thing about autism is that we need to stim. So stimming is just any kind of like sensory input that you're seeking in some way. Everybody does it. Like, people like stroke their chin, their beard, and they like play with their hair. Like, everybody stims. This isn't chew their lip, whatever it is. But autistic people need to do it at a higher rate. And we're doing it because we're regulating our nervous system. We're either getting too much sensory input that's unmanageable, or we're not getting enough. And we're like, am I on this planet still? Am I in a body? What the fuck is going on? And so we need more input to be able to regulate our arousal level and our nervous system. And so we need to sometimes balance our senses. So if I'm having a really intolerable sense that I cannot get away from, I might seek out some other sense. So if there's a sound I can't stand, I might try to focus on like a physical touch sensation that feels good, or a smell that feels good, to try to at least like not overwhelm my brain. Sometimes it backfires, because then I just have like 14 senses coming in instead of one. And so it's a little bit tricky. But anyway, that's a big part of my experience. And so sitting stock still, tricky. And of course, all this causes a lot of fatigue. I'm masking all the time. I have this trauma. I have dissociation, right? So I'm in the sensory hell, and all of this stuff is it's exhausting. I'm also masking in a social way. I don't know what's going on most of the time in conversations. I don't understand what people are doing. And so there's a huge amount of masking for me as well. So this leads into the fatigue. And as a person with ADHD, I call myself an ADHDer, I need to move. My body needs to move. Now, mindfulness is well known to be helpful for ADHD, within reason, like in a normal limit. Before I ever came to Zen practice, I had over the years cultivated a sort of intuitive mindfulness practice. It actually came from a formal meditation practice, but I had allowed myself, out of not knowing any better, to just do what worked for me. And I would do 5 to 10 minutes a day of really formal sitting meditation, because that was what worked for me. That let me see what was going on in my mind. It let me kind of come back into my body, take the temperature, what's going on emotionally, all that kind of stuff, without this, what I feel like was an immersion in multi-day retreats of like, just jump in the deep end and like mindfulness until you die. And I spent a year actually seeing an ADHD therapist, and we were talking about what is the diagnosis, because the diagnosis was a surprise to me. All of this stuff was diagnosed in my mid-40s, so huge surprise, no idea. Always thought there was just something wrong with me. And now I'm like, oh, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm just different. So I'm unpacking this ADHD diagnosis with this therapist. What does that mean for me? What behavior experiences in my life can I re-understand now with this new information? And when she realized what I was actually doing with these retreats, like that I was trying to sit for 15 hours a day, I was alternating between Zazen and Kinhin with just a few breaks here and there. Her eyes got so big and she was like, I don't know if that's a great idea. And I was like, I might have to agree with you. So this is the only body mind I have. Can't change it out. Can't exchange it at the store. It's all I got. And this interacted with my formal Zen practice in a lot of ways. So one of the big things that took a long time for me and my teacher to understand was how to deal with pain during Zazen or Sesshin. And over and over again, I asked people in Dokusan, how do you work with pain? How do you work with pain? And people gave me a lot of advice and it was fine. And I tried to be helpful. So, investigate the pain, right? Like move towards it or move away from it and like see it. Is it constant? Like ask question. Is it constant? Is it coming and going? Is it throbbing? Is it burning? Right? Like kind of just like, grope around the edges of it and like get to know it. And I could see very clearly that I had both pain and resistance to the pain. And so I thought, I can work with the resistance, right? So we'll get to that in a second. But we weren't talking about the same thing. Finally, we realized when my teacher was talking about pain, they were talking about like, my knee really hurts. I've been sitting for 25 minutes. The bell hasn't rung yet. And my knee has gotten kind of stiff and it hurts. But I know from my whole lived experience that the bell's going to ring and I'm going to get up and shake it off. And in a few minutes, it's going to be fine. And I'll be doing Kinhin and it'll be great. That's not what happens to me. I know that I am in the middle of an injury. This is causing an injury. And I know that based on my own lived experience. And so enduring that is a whole different ball game. Think about if you go into a kitchen and somebody turns the stove on and they say, put your hand on the stove, and you put your hand on the stove and it starts burning. And they're like, now just investigate that. Investigate that pain. What does that feel like? Move towards it. That's fucking bullshit. You need to get your hand off that stove. You need to stop creating an injury. And you know it. Your body and your brain know that you're making an injury. And they will lose their fucking shit if you don't try to get out of that. Like, that's how we survive as animals. And so me sitting through these known injury-making postures for hours on end was me just trying to pretend this isn't going to cause an injury and I shouldn't be freaking out about it because I'm just overreacting to this pain. And so it's hard to explain the depth of how misunderstood we were, both of us. We did not understand that we were talking about different things. And the minute we got this pain versus injury vocabulary, it was like, oh, I'm going on sabbatical. Like, everything stops. So what I experienced during Zazen is a huge amount of sympathetic activation. So that's the fight-flight response. And I would just I could feel the adrenaline like squirt into my bloodstream, and I could just feel how like activated I was, and that there was this sort of panicky, like, I am in danger and I need to address this. No, you're not allowed to get up. No, you got to wait for the bell. Everyone else is sitting, just sit through it, right? And it's like, but there's another part of my brain that's like, this is life-threatening. We need to attend to this injury or this threatening situation that we're in. And nobody ever explored that with me. Nobody ever said, oh, are you in your fight or flight? Or are you, I was stock still. Nobody on the outside knew what was going on the inside because that's how good I am at masking. So nobody ever even asked me if that was happening. So I had no idea that this wasn't the desired state. I was like, I don't know, maybe that's what Zen is just learning to sit through your fight-flight activation for hours on end. Like, that's how you master it, is just by sitting through it. So I just assumed it was like exposure therapy to like total dysregulation, and that if you do it long enough, you would like overcome the body's response. So I either was in that fight or flight, or I would go into a freeze state where I would almost stop breathing and I would just be trying to like shut down and get out of my body as much as I could. So one of the big things for me specifically is upper back pain. Huge muscle spasms, just a lot of problems in that part of my back. And for most of my life, I had very large breasts. And so I was like, but maybe that's part of the problem. And so while I was working in this priest in training mode, I was like, maybe I can get a breast reduction and that'll help some of my back pain. And so I did. So I'm going to repeat that to you. I surgically altered my body in an attempt to practice in the only way that had been shown to me. You have to sit upright. You have to sit still. You have to endure this. This posture is the only way. And the only thing I could think to help would be to surgically alter my body. And there was this huge disconnect for me because over and over and over, people would say, take care of your body, take care of your body, take care of your body. But I never saw anyone doing that. Because what I would need to take care of my body is lay down or leave. And nobody was ever doing that. And so I just was like, this is a mind fuck. They're telling me to take care of my body, but nobody's actually taking care of my body. So this is like some neurotypical game where they say one thing, but they mean another. And I don't know what the fuck's supposed to be happening. So I never saw anybody modeling what I needed to do. And I put this down to a lack of disabled teachers. If there had been people with a variety of physical impairments or chronic health issues or pain who were practicing regularly at my center, maybe I would have seen somebody taking care of their body in the way that this body needs to be taken care of. But I never saw that because, as far as I know, they weren't at my center. And so I think there's a real problem here that we don't have disabled people in the ranks of teachers and leadership. And therefore, people in the Sangha are not getting the support that they need because their bodies aren't being represented by the teachers. And I feel that there's a lack of trauma awareness in teachers, right? Nobody ever asked me, are you going into fight or flight? Are you stuck in a dissociative freeze? That language didn't even exist during Dokusan for me. And those kinds of questions are really important to ask people because you need to know what's going on. And that's not appropriate to be sitting in fight or flight. That's not Zazen. I realize that now, but I didn't know. For years I did that because I mean, that's what happened to me. And I assumed that's what was happening to everybody. So I had no idea. So at some point during this priest training program, I started to go to therapy. So first I started with somatic experiencing, which is really interesting because it's it's just checking in. It's talk therapy mixed with checking in with what's happening in your body. And so using that as a source of information and awareness about what's going on in the body-mind system. And it was helpful to me because it was somebody guiding me through it with a lot of specific questions. And so I wasn't just left to myself on the cushion to like, good luck, hope you don't hurt yourself. But instead it was like constant back and forth, checking in with what's happening. My therapist was attending to my arousal state. So if I was starting to like wig out because something was activating a trauma response, she could see that and she could help me regulate back into that window of tolerance. So I started explaining to her what Zazen was actually like. Which was terrifying. It sort of popped out of my mouth and I was like, oh my God. So first there was this idea of pain and versus resistance, right? So I could from the first retreat I went on, I could very clearly see the physical pain that I was experiencing and my resistance to that pain. I could totally see that they were separate things. And I thought, oh, great. I can't help the pain. Body's what it is, but I can work with the resistance. That's what I'm here for, is to like investigate that resistance and like kind of break through and break free from it so that I'm not like held captive by my resistance, by my aversion, right? Like pushed around by the winds of the world. So I thought, oh, I'm supposed to work with my resistance. So I'm going to investigate it. What is it? What's over there? Where does it come from? What does it feel like? Why is it so strong? So I'm like pecking away at this resistance. And so it's in my, right? So sitting in my mind, I'm like, peck away at that resistance. And what it felt to me was that, and this is disgusting, there was a wall of flesh, so like muscle with no skin on it. In my mind, there was this wall of flesh. It was very clearly over here. And behind it was the resistance. There was something back there that was like keeping me from just letting the pain be what it is and was like resisting it. And I couldn't get to it. And so I was like pounding on this wall, like pounding as hard as I could to try to get through it and see what is over there. What is that resistance over there? And all the whole time, there's a voice inside of me that is screaming, no, at the top of its lungs. So this description popped out of my mouth in one of my somatic experiencing therapy sessions. And it was like, what am I doing? That is horrible. Like, why am I doing this to myself? And it was funny because that session had actually started out with me saying, I'm really not, I struggle to know what my feelings are. I struggle to know what I'm feeling. And I don't know when I want to do something or when I don't want to do something. I kid you not. That was how I started the session. And I described this whole experience. And then I'm like, oh, this voice screaming no inside me. And then I was like, is that what you mean by no? I don't even think the therapist said anything. I mean, like, what are you going to say? Like, no, it doesn't get any more obvious than that. Wow. Right? So that's the level of just disconnect I was having from my own experience. And when I think about it now, that resistance, what's behind that wall, I go back to this idea of sensory trauma as an infant. That in a pre-verbal state, I didn't know what was going on, and my body felt threatened, that it's a safety survival problem. And my body, my baby mind was like, we cannot get away from these sensations, and we don't know what to do with them, and they feel like we're going to die. And I'm going to just put it over there in that compartment, and I'm going to just put it away, because otherwise I'm going to explode, right? Like my brain's going to explode from this like constant trauma. And so I was trying to like investigate some like deep survival response that my body came up with before I even had words. And I'm not sure that kind of thing can really be investigated in the way that we talk about investigating things during Zazen. So it's just bad. And then I also told you about the second therapist that I was seeing when we unpacked my ADHD diagnosis, who was like, what are you doing in those retreats? Like, that does not sound productive or good or kind or anything. And I took away from this, you can do Zazen wrong. And people were like, you can't do it wrong. There's no way to do it wrong. Let me tell you, you can fucking do it wrong. If you're hurting yourself, you're doing it wrong. That is not Zazen. I didn't know that because nobody was ever able to explain that to me. Nobody had the words to articulate it. And I didn't know that anybody else was having a different experience. This is the problem of all of us only having our own body mind and not actually knowing what anyone else is experiencing. And as teachers, we need to be able to, I'm not going to know what you're experiencing, but I can start to have vocabulary and I can ask important questions to try to scope out the bounds of your experience. And if you're over here in this dysregulation, trauma, fight, flight, activation, whatever it is, that's okay. I mean, it's okay to see it. It's okay to spend a few minutes there to investigate it, but you shouldn't be sitting there for all of your retreat. Also, if you're over here in the like blissed out, like on another planet, that feels nice. Everybody likes it. Like total daydreaming, right? Fantasizing, whatever it is. Also feels nice. Also not really Zazen, and you need to be coming back over here. So we have to have language to talk about the sort of scope or the realm of our experience, even if you're never going to actually understand mine. So you can do Zazen wrong. And I am now traumatized by meditation itself. So even if I'm in a non-injuring posture, so I'm laying down in a way that I'm completely supported and I'm not having to use muscles to hold myself up, I totally start dysregulating because my body's like, oh my God, are we going to have to go back to that place where we're like chipping at that flesh wall in the mind, right? Like I just totally start to panic about it. And so I now am struggling to do Zazen of any kind because my experience of trying to do it formally was so harmful to me. It harmed my body, it harmed my emotional center, and it harmed like my soul, like my psyche. And so I took a sabbatical. Obviously, because there was no way that I could unpack this while also trying to be a priest in training and showing up on Sundays and showing up at retreats. Like there was no way. So I needed space to investigate my experience without any expectations of me having to do anything. And at first I was like, oh, I don't trust my body. That fucking tricked me and all this kind of stuff, right? And that was how I started talking about it. And I had a really bad dislocation one day. So total patellar dislocation, the kneecaps, woo, and down I go. And I mean, just really, it was pretty bad. And I like bad enough that I bothered to go to the doctor, which I have subluxed that knee literally thousands of times. I can do a rolling over in bed. So I don't usually go to the doctor for it, but I was like, it's pretty bad. So I went to the doctor, PT, blah, blah. And all of a sudden I was like, what if it's that my body doesn't trust me? Because over and over again, I put my body in these situations where it gets harmed. Like, I just feel, I've always had this idea, like, I'm just this brain that's dragging this meat sack around because I have to. It's the only way to keep the brain alive. And like, oh, just make the meat sack do what you need it to do. Just do this thing. Just do it. And I was like, what if my body's like, I don't trust you, motherfucker? Because, like, I don't treat body well. So why would body trust mind, right? Like, we don't have a good relationship historically. And all my Zen practice just, like, aggravated that adversarial relationship. Like, I'm going to double down on making this body do what I need it to do. And I was like, oh. So if my body doesn't trust me, what would it look like to cultivate a relationship of radical trust between my body and my mind? It gives me chills even now to say that. What would that look like? If my body was like a partner, we're in this together, buddy. Like, how can we make this work for all of us? The brain and the body, right? Like, whatever. However we want to conceive of our different experiences physically and in our mind. And so one of the things I got interested in sabbatical was I read this book called Anti-Diet. And so it talked a lot about intuitive eating. And, everyone can be a little weird about food. And I don't consider myself particularly disordered around food. But what I loved about intuitive eating is it's the only space I have ever found where people are really very concretely addressing this issue of trust, of the body trusting the mind, and that there being this trusting sort of partnering relationship. And then how do you start to develop that kind of trusting relationship? What does it look like? Like, very concretely and direct. And then what comes out of that? Once you start to live in this space of trust and partnership and well-being, all these things start to come out of that grounding. And so I was like, oh my God, there's somebody actually talking about this stuff that I'm trying to figure out. What would it look like to cultivate a relationship of radical trust between the body and mind, right? Like, whoa. So and then back to Zen practice. What does it mean to make non-harming effort? Like, I totally get that Zen practice it takes effort. We have to bring some efforting to the process. It's not going to just like fall off a log and happen for us. I get that. And I'm not afraid of hard work. Like, believe me. But how do I do it in a way that's non-harming? And people talk a lot about the middle way in Zen. But what normal people have described to me as the middle way, which may be the middle way for them, is actually for me like ultra ascetic, like totally harmful, totally violent, just destroy the body is a way to get to enlightenment. And the means justifying the ends kind of makes my brain explode. And so there's a lot of space in there where I get really confused because you talk about middle way, but that's not my middle way. That's super, super ascetic. It's super like violent to my body. And I have my own middle way if you'd let me have the space to find it. And the thing that is really hard for me is that if I'm starting from a ground of something that's ascetic and something that at its heart involves submission of the body and taming or submission of the mind, then right from zero, I'm in this adversarial, violent relationship. This thing has to be subdued. It has to be overcome. It has to be pushed through. Like, whatever it is violent and destructive. And that's just me internally, right? Like, that's just me working with myself. And if I'm starting from that kernel of violence, how am I ever going to show up in the world and not be bringing that like black ooze with me? How can I show up as in the world in a non-violent way if I'm being violent to myself? I really, this is a serious question for me. And there's a lot of layers because one, there's me doing what you think is middle way, but I find ascetic. So that's definitely violent for me. So that's definitely wrong. But even people who talk about their middle way, there's a real fetishization of suffering in Zen that I've experienced. Not everybody, not all the time, but there's a lot of samurai Zen. And there's just sort of like gradations of I'm like the super samurai versus just sort of the light samurai. But all of it's over in this like samurai realm of like, suffering is the key. We have to go through the pinnacle of suffering to get to the end game. And so there's a suffering inherent in it, which it just makes me uneasy. Partly because like I already have enough suffering. Like you don't need to drum any extra up for me. But also if that's the only way to get through it, I don't understand how going through this path is going to make you show up over here. So it's confusing. So the other thing I ran into, an idea that I really loved, is there's a talk by Parker Palmer, and he's talking about the soul as a wild animal, and you can't just go crashing into the woods and like find the deer and the wild animals because they're just going to scatter, right? Like you can't just rush up there. So he was like, oh, you have to go out and you have to like sit on a rock and like be really quiet, and then maybe the birds or the chipmunks will come out and you'll be able to see them. And I love that image. But what I feel for myself is that Zazen, where I'm like sitting there like staring down at my soul, is very aggressive and is not conducive. And I need to get quiet in a way that lets my soul come out. But Zazen is not that kind of quiet for me. I need other things in order to produce that state of like calm alertness that my soul feels safe enough to come out. And so I think that's a really interesting juxtaposition about the idea is true, but the form is not the right fit. And so the last piece of what I've been really working on in my sabbatical is a third kind of therapy. It's called internal family systems or parts work. And so it's, when you say, oh, part of me really wants to go to the mall, but part of me wants to stay home on the couch, right? Like that's what we're talking about is like, oh, there's sort of it's almost like there's two things going on in there. And where are they coming from? They have different desires and needs and they're trying to meet different needs for myself, right? Whatever it is. So it's kind of investigating that. But the form of the therapy is like minute to minute, my therapist is checking in with me about what I'm feeling. So again, it's a very body-based therapy and sort of what's going on, what images are appearing in my mind or what thoughts are arising or whatever. And every single step of the way, she's asking explicitly for consent. If she starts to bring something up and then I'm like, oh, I feel like there's ice in my veins. And she's like, oh, okay. Like clearly she doesn't say this, but clearly that's a part who's not okay with us looking into whatever it was we were going to talk about. And we're not going to just barrel through that response. We're going to investigate that. What is that ice part afraid of? What is it concerned is going to happen? So we need to get consent from that ice part before we go investigate this other thing. Because ice part is telling me something. It's saying no. And if I habitually over and over and over again, every time that no comes up, I just move right through it onto the next thing, I'm no longer safe in my own mind. And so this process of over and over and over getting micro consent and micro consent and over again is teaching me directly, concretely, how to be safe in my own mind, how to investigate what's happening in there without it turning into this pickaxe on that wall. And so I feel like she's giving me really direct instruction in boundless friendliness. How can I have boundless friendliness for everything that's happening in my mind and everything that's happening in my body? And being thrown on a cushion for Zazen, maybe other people learn to cultivate that boundless, like the boundless friendliness just spontaneously comes out of sitting on the cushion long enough. That did not happen for me. And I needed someone to show me how to be boundlessly friendly to myself. And so this therapy is really helpful because it just over and over and over again, she's reminding me about what consent feels like. What does yes feel like? What does no feel like? And what do we do with a no? Do we just blow through it or do we turn and investigate that a little bit and see what's going on there? And when I tell people about this, everyone's like, yeah, everyone's Zen face lights up. They're like, yes, this is Zen. This is what we're trying to cultivate, is this kind of like curious, nurturing, consenting investigation. So like I'm doing it right now, but I couldn't do it on the cushion. And being thrown onto the cushion with the instructions that I was given was like the opposite of this feeling. And so it just seems outrageous to me that you would like describe a physical posture and daily schedule and expect that this outcome is going to happen without any like thread in between. So, and people talked about this stuff, but like, again, when you say take care of your body and then I don't see you doing it, I'm like, this is just another neurotypical like mind fuck. And I don't really know what you're talking about. And so for me, that this whole thing has come down to is this idea of radical consent. And that I have the right to say no. And when my body says no, I have the right to listen to it. And this is not the same thing as picking and choosing. And I get so frustrated when people talk about, oh, picking and choosing and aversion and you know, whatever, loss or whatever. It's like, yeah, of course I have that too. Like, yeah, of course I'd rather have like a cookie than, you know, healthy cereal. Like, of course I'd rather have all these other things. Like, of course I have wants and desires. And of course I let them get to me because I'm a human being like everybody else. So I totally understand like picking and choosing and preferring and wanting and resisting and whatever, right? Like those are all fine and true. And I'm absolutely working with them. And I'm not saying you shouldn't, but it needs to be done in this framework of radical consent. That when some part of me says no, I'm able to stop. And that's the only way that there's going to be trust here, is if I have complete autonomy to consent to what I'm doing. So when I turn my mind back to Zazen and back to the forms of Soto Zen practice, I just, I kind of ran into a few questions. So one of them is, what is Zazen? What is the point? Why are the instructions the way they are? And what conditions are you trying to create, right? Like they're obviously instructions for a reason, because there's some idea that it's going to create some condition or cultivate some space or there's something going on. Otherwise we wouldn't do it, right? It's obvious that there's something there. And, for me, it's frustrating because people describe the posture and they describe the time periods and all these kinds of external things. And I'm like, but that doesn't give me any information about what I'm supposed to be experiencing and not being checked in with either, right? Like there was no vocabulary for like, oh, by the way, this is the experience you're supposed to have. In fact, when I asked about it, I was told specifically that in Zen, we don't really talk about our direct experience during Zazen. It's kind of a taboo. We're not supposed to be talking about our moment-to-moment experience in Zazen. So how am I ever supposed to have realized that what I was doing was really not what we were supposed to be doing, right? Like, you got to be able to talk about it, folks. And you got to be able to look at the principle of what we're doing versus the rule, right? Like, just describing the posture and, like, setting a timer doesn't feel like it's necessarily going to give people the information that they need. So, I don't know. And then, in my essay, I asked this question, what is at the heart of Soto Zen? Is it the forms? Because if bodies have to do specific things, then we're done, right? Certain bodies aren't going to be able to do that. And therefore, by definition, those people cannot be part of Soto Zen in a meaningful way. And that may be the answer. That may be true, that those forms are you cannot let go of them. You just can't dismember them from Zen and have it still be Soto Zen. And that may be true, although I encourage you to be honest about that rather than pretending that there's no barriers and then there's really barriers. And the same thing for me is about, so there's this question of Zazen, and then there's this question of like priest training and retreats. And it's the same idea. What is the principle? What are we trying to cultivate here versus the rule of, well, you sit this many sit sessions and it's this many days long and blah, 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 right? Because obviously it wasn't working for me, and it wasn't cultivating the kind of conditions that people thought it was. It was just injuring me on multiple levels. And the thing about priest training is, if practice isn't all things, which many people say to me, why does priest training only focus on a few of them? Why is all of the rest of experience and practice left out of priest training? So I experienced a lot of ableism in my Soto Zen priest training. So people tried to offer things as an accommodation, and it really made me feel marginalized in others. It was very much a deficit model of like, well, this is the way that you're supposed to do it, but clearly there's something wrong with your body and you can't, so we'll let you do it this other way. And it really made me feel like I was not supposed to be there. Oh, I see my light just fell out. Oh, well. So there was definitely a right way, and then they were going to make an exception for me. So that's very othering. I can just tell you full stop. That's an othering experience to frame it in that way. And it puts all the burden on me. I had to have black belt boundaries because there was this relentless pressure to conform. This is the right way, and there's this like the weight of the tradition and the weight of everybody else in the Zendo and all this stuff just constantly pressing on me, pushing me towards doing it the right way. And I had to constantly over and over again say no, 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 no. And that's a big ask, right? That takes a lot of inner strength. Not something I came to the table with. Not everybody does. I mean, it's awesome if people do. And I love those people who are like, nope. And they just know their own boundaries. Like, oh, I'd love to have that. But like, I didn't come in with that. And so putting me into that situation was kind of a recipe for disaster. So I had one priest say to me that the heart of Soto Zen was put my body in a room with other bodies and I wordlessly ask it to do what they are doing. And I was like, that's kind of beautiful. Like the way that like we can like navigate the space and move around and not be bumping into each other. Like it's actually kind of beautiful and like one big organism made of multiple human bodies. But wow, is that ableist? If you're not even going to talk about what we're doing, like how am I supposed to even know that I can take care of my body, right? Like it just is insane. There was phrasing that made me feel like I didn't belong. So people would say, well, you know, there's cushions, but you can get a chair if you need to. And it felt very paternalistic. Like, oh, you poor thing, you can get a chair. We'll let you do it. We won't kick you out of the Zendo for that. So there's a right way to do it, but certain exceptions are going to be allowed, but only certain ones, right? So when I talked about laying down to try to alleviate some of my physical pain, oh, well, you can lay down, but just not in the Zendo. So you can go downstairs in the basement and lay on the floor. Well, you can lay down in the Zendo, but do it over there behind that shoji screen so that you're not, people don't have to see you. Well, you can lay down in the Zendo, but only in the back of the room so that you're not disruptive. Or, most people fall asleep when they do laying down Zazen. And so this kind of implying that this is why they wouldn't really allow it or encourage it because people would fall asleep. And it was just over and over again, these kinds of things. And I started to ask people, like, is enlightenment, for whatever that means, is that only available to the able-bodied? And everyone's like, oh my God, no, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard when I ask it. I'm like, yeah. And yet, this form seems to only be available to a certain subset of bodies. Like, by definition, bodies are being excluded from this in the way that it was shown to me. And so how do I avoid drawing this conclusion that it's only available to certain people? And so the things, I've been working with all these ideas on my sabbatical. It's now been almost 3 years, which is almost as long as I was doing priest training. And I've been investigating contemplative practices versus monastic practices. Because I had thought those were the same, and now I'm starting to feel like they're different. And that the monastic practice that I encountered in the Soto Zen tradition in America felt ascetic to me, and felt punishing, and involved a lot of suffering. And for me, what I mean by contemplative is that I have the space to create inner space. So I'm able to settle into my body. I'm able to kind of see what's going on. I'm able to ride the wave of an emotion that comes through, or, see my resistances coming up, but in a really gentle and kind way. And so contemplative practice can involve many, many, many types of things versus monastic practice, which, as I've seen it, involves a real small subset of physical activities. There's sesshin, and there's zazen, and there's oryoki, and there's these very sort of physical specific things. Whereas contemplative practice, that can be anything, right? That can be walks in nature. I can be doing, mindful needlework. Like there's all kinds of other ways to be doing contemplative practice. And so I've been trying to tease those apart. And I wrote my own vows of renunciation. So we took vows of renunciation when we ordained, and I decided to write my own, and which I'll read you in a minute. And I am wondering how we can create a world where we all belong. Is there a Zen center where I would feel like I belonged? Because I don't right now. So I hereby take vows of renunciation. I renounce forcing my body to meet another body's expectation. I renounce gaslighting myself about my own body-mind. I renounce battling and suppressing my natural sensory and nervous systems. I renounce bodily harm in the name of masking and putting neurotypicals at ease. I renounce living up to other people's standards. I renounce fitting in. I renounce masking. I renounce dogma and ignoring my body's signals. I renounce the word should and shame-inducing, harmful words like lazy, indulgent, or needy. I renounce voluntary situations that send me into fight or flight. I renounce clothing or grooming practices that hurt me or put me into sensory overwhelm. I renounce performative busyness, including clocking hours and meditation. I renounce the adversarial relationship with my beautiful, unique, and energetic mind. I renounce harmful and traumatizing stillness. I renounce movement and postures that injure me. I renounce practices that are extreme asceticism or self-abuse for this body-mind.